Hi, good evening, everyone. I said good evening. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that's our live studio audience. My name is Joe Stoltz. I'm the director of the George Washington Leadership Institute here at Mount Vernon. Thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's Ford Evening Book Talk, sponsored by the Ford Motor Corporation. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just want to let you all know about a few other upcoming events that will all pale in comparison, but I'm contractually obligated to just let you know these are also things you can do. October 11th, Maurizio Valsania, who was a former fellow at the library, will be here to discuss his new book, First Among Men, George Washington and the Myth of American Masculinity. I mean, we don't need to call it a myth. I'm standing right here. October 13th will be the USC George Washington Sol Price Leadership Lecture, which actually won't be a lecture this year. What we're going to do is screen the new documentary that Mount Vernon has put together called George Washington and the Pursuit of Religious Freedom. If that's not enough of a draw, there will also be free food and drink for that event. So that's exciting. And then November 4th and 5th is going to be the 2022 George Washington Symposium, which is going to be on mapping the American Revolution. This is going to actually be held up in the library. Weird that we're going to do a library program in the library. I know that's confusing, but it's be a chance to really explore some of the amazing new maps that are now in the library's collection, and we're going to have a great discussion about that. So now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, John Avlon, who is the author, is an author, columnist, and commentator. He's the senior political analyst and a fill-in anchor at CNN, appearing on New Day every morning. From 2013 to 2018, he was the editor-in-chief and managing director of the Daily Beast, during which time the site's traffic more than doubled to over 1 million readers a day, while winning 17 journalism awards. He is the author of the books Independent Nation, Wingnuts, and Washington's Farewell. That's not one title. Those are three separate books. That could be a fun mashup piece. As well as co-editor of the acclaimed Deadline Artists Journalism Anthologies. John served as chief speechwriter to New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani and won the National Society of Newspaper Columnists Award for Best Online Column in 2012. Now, that's what he has on his website. I want to tell you about a fun personal anecdote I have about John. So John has been a good friend of Mount Vernon for many years. John found out that a few of us from the library were heading up to New York City to go to the Antique Books Fair. They send some of us each year just to make sure there's nothing there that Mount Vernon doesn't want, right? And sometimes we buy stuff, sometimes win under the money, sometimes we just don't see anything we'd like. John found out we were going to be up there, and he wanted to host the Mount Vernon staff that were going to be there. And we thought, yeah, okay, sure. You're a very busy person. Like, this probably isn't going to actually happen. Sure enough, I don't even remember what the event was, but there was some sort of breaking news event, and you texted us letting us know that, like, you were going to be delayed. And we're like, yep, okay, there it is. Things happen. No hard feelings. And he said, no. Go to the bar in what was at the time the Time Warner building. Talk to the hostess. Tell her you're John Avlon's guest. They'll take care of you until I get down from doing my hit on CNN. We thought, again, sure, yeah, because I'm going to show up at a random bar in New York City that happens to be in the building that CNN's in, and they will, of course, just seat me and think that I'm completely legit. What could go wrong? Sure enough, we show up. The staff was very gracious. They took care of us. And as soon as he was done with the hit, John was coming down, literally still wiping makeup off of his face to make sure that the Mount Vernon staff got to experience New York City in the best way possible. So that is the type of person that he is. And that's why we were all heartbroken when he found out he was moving on from George Washington, at least temporarily. So he is here tonight to talk about his new book, about the 16th president of the United States, which isn't number one. I'm just a humanities major, but it's not, 16's not number one. But we are genuinely, John, thrilled to have you here tonight to talk about your new book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. Ladies and gentlemen, Mount Vernon's good friend, John Avlon.
Thank you very much. And it is always an honor to be back here in Mount Vernon. I mean, this is a sacred civic space, and Washington is the foundation of us all, and his echoes through history are one of the signs of continuity, and that's true for Lincoln as well. When you go write books, you give book talks, and you get in a rhythm, and it's a little bit like jazz. You know the tune, but the notes and rhythm may change on any given night. But what I wanted to do is do something a little bit different with you all, which is talk about Washington and Lincoln. Talk about the way that Washington inspired Abraham Lincoln. And there are notes throughout Lincoln and the Fight for Peace that addresses that. And then also look at their particular leadership styles and how they succeeded in being uniters in a divided time. Because it seems to me that that's a skill that we could all stand to learn right about now. Washington is a major touchstone for Abraham Lincoln. To some extent, that may seem inevitable, right? I mean, as Lincoln is born, the founding generation is just leaving the stage, but their legend looms large. And as a young man, as a child, really, here's Abraham Lincoln without the benefit of any schooling, growing up in a log cabin, a dirt log cabin in first Kentucky, then Indiana. But one of the books that he gloms onto and reads incessantly is Parson Weems' biography of George Washington. It's a touchstone for him. It gives him a sense of the civic firmament under which we all live. That sense of opportunities and obligations that can give purpose and meaning to a young republic. To such an extent that when Lincoln is traveling to Washington, the city, to give his first inauguration, Washington is very much on his mind. As he leaves Springfield, Illinois, he says, "I'm now going to face a task that rests upon me that is greater than even rested upon Washington." They were an unlikely pair, and Lincoln coming out the worst by comparison. He's not a general. He's a prairie lawyer with one term in Congress. But as he's traveling towards Washington for his first inauguration, Lincoln stops in Trenton, New Jersey. Now, Civil War hasn't started, but it seems to be heading in that direction. Lincoln's opponents threatened secession as a way of trying to dissuade voters from pulling the lever for the Republican ticket that year. It was a startup third party, a moderate progressive party devoted to stopping the expansion of slavery at the very least. And it seemed that they were going to make good on that threat. There's already the psychological preconditions of Civil War had been met. But no one had fired on Fort Sumter just yet. And Lincoln stops in Trenton, New Jersey, and gives a speech to the state legislature. And even with all those political pressures and expectations on him, he surprised the members of the state legislature by talking with them about George Washington. Specifically, he says how the stories from the American Revolution inspired him as a child. And he pointed out that they were meeting just a few miles from where Washington and his troops famously crossed the Delaware in that daring midnight raid on Christmas, 1776. And this is what Lincoln said to them. "I recall thinking then, boy, even though I was, that there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for," Lincoln said. "Something even more than national independence. That's something that held out a great promise to all the people of the world for all time to come." He's seeing America's purpose through a child's eyes, manifested through a man about to become president at a moment of maximum crisis. Washington founding the nation, Lincoln being called to defend it. But the common through line is that America has a meaning beyond itself. That's what Lincoln believed, and that's what Washington believed. that our patriotism is much more than mere nationalism. And our success is not for ourselves alone. I love that one of the terms Lincoln used in this speech for the American people is God's almost chosen people. We're not a nation founded upon any illusions of divinity, but we aspire to something bigger. And we've got a sacred trust, Lincoln is saying. We've got a sacred trust to preserve the liberty and the democracy that were won for us by the founding generation. You know, in Lincoln's first famous speech called the Lyceum Address that he gives when he's just 27 years old, he ruminates on the responsibilities we have now that the founding generation has left the stage. And he famously says, as a nation of free men, we must either live for all time or die by suicide. That we have a special obligation to the nation. We have a special obligation to carry forward that example of the founding fathers and the gifts that Washington and his colleagues gave us. And that they were men within living memory. They weren't distant figures put upon a pedestal. But I think it all goes back to this idea, in some ways founded here, that America is the only nation in the history of the world, and we forget this, that is founded on an idea and not a tribal identity. That's revolutionary because it's open to everyone who buys in. It also means that when people come peddling tribal identities in our politics, it's uniquely destructive. It also means, in a more hopeful sense, that our nation depends upon telling unified stories rooted in our real history. And that's what Washington's story had been for young Abraham Lincoln. That the sacrifices and the daring of the founding generation was something that gave meaning and purpose and force. But now it was being threatened by these tribal forces that many founders, including Washington, had warned about. And so it was a testing time for a new generation of Americans, as it perhaps perpetually is. And that what Lincoln was saying was, now it's up to us to take that germ of inspiration and carry it forward, to make the old stories new again, to add new chapters based on that foundation. And I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating at looking at the way in which Lincoln was inspired by Washington. It's not this sense of slavish devotion of putting him on a pedestal in a distant corner. It's a real life communication saying we're carrying forward their story. Now it's time to write our chapter. And if we write it well, the story will continue. And Lincoln and Washington are uniquely joined. You see this great picture here, and there are many of them. I've got one in my house, and they're both standing over a funeral pyre, and they're shaking hands. But it's one man founded liberty, the other defended it. Lincoln had just passed away and ascended into the heavens, into that civic firmament. But that's what I want to talk to you about, is the ways in which Washington inspired Abraham Lincoln and the secrets, their leadership secrets, many of which, though they were vastly different men, they shared in common. And the way it really does teach us how to be a uniter in divided times. It's important to understand that the founders did fear the Civil War that erupted on Lincoln's watch, even when the country and the Constitution were being founded. This was a clear and present danger that the founders anticipated. It was something they discussed. It was why it was important to have that compromise at the Constitutional Convention. Washington, as a Virginian, was someone who could unite the nation, but he even confessed to his attorney general that if a civil war were to emerge, that he would fight on the side of the North, that the intention was to have slavery slowly evolve out of existence through its isolation. That's why it was banned in the Northwest province. And that's why that was something that Lincoln and his generation constantly looked to, and why the compromise decision to expand slavery was such a flashpoint, because they believed it was in violation of the founding fathers' wisdom and wishes to put slavery on a gradual path to extinction. Washington and his generation anticipated this danger. They worried about it. It's a reminder that our native optimism as a country, which does exist, we're an optimistic people. We're always looking forward. We're always looking to the future. We do believe the future will be better than the past, is always balanced by this native pessimism that doesn't get quite as much press. That the founding fathers, and not just John Adams, are constantly worrying about what could possibly go wrong. That James Madison in particular is bringing back documents that Jefferson is sending from Europe, looking at how past democratic republics had failed in ancient Greece and Rome. And those lessons are being incorporated into our country's structures. That's how worried they were about the danger of civil war. That's why Washington is so aware of the power of his precedent every step of the way. And his major role as president is to try to emphasize national unity. You know, I did write a book about Washington's farewell address, and it's his warning to future generations, where he establishes the precedent of the peaceful transfer of power, which we have, I think, taken for granted for much of our republic until recently. But he is really focused on how we can unite as a nation. Because we're 13 colonies, really spread apart. And so everything Washington is doing, including in the farewell address, is about reminding us that we are much stronger united than we are divided, as a practical matter, from safety, as a matter of national prosperity. He's trying to drum home constantly the dangers of people who would try to sow division, particularly with an eye on the Mason-Dixon line. And he's successful. You know, he wants to retire. George Washington wants to retire at the end of his first term. And this is genuine. He wants to go back to Mount Vernon. This is not a Cincinnatus pose. He wants to go home. But the one thing that Jefferson and Hamilton can agree upon at that time is that if Washington retires and leaves the stage too early, they believe the nation will devolve into a civil war. We weren't in a strong enough place yet to be a stable, independent nation. And so Washington reluctantly stayed on another term. But that's how clear and present this danger was. And Lincoln and Washington constantly is warning about the dangers of division. You know, I'll just read one or two sections where he talks in his farewell address. So the unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is now dear to you. It is the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence. It is the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, your safety, your prosperity, that very liberty with you so highly prize. He's constantly telling folks that don't listen to these demagogues. Be careful of people who would divide you. He says cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men who would try to foment political parties or turn one part of the country against the other. He says it will distract the public council and enfeeble public administration, agitating the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindling the animosity of one part against another. He said it foments occasionally riot and insurrection. These are the dangers of division that Washington spends an enormous amount of his time warning about. But he's also trying to set forward a positive example about focusing on the things that can unite us and not divide us. And so you can see in Lincoln's leadership that spirit carrying forward, despite the fact they're very different men. And let's dwell upon that difference for a section, because it's a reminder that a similar spirit can flow through people who are very different, right? Washington is a gentleman farmer. He is above all a general. He is enormously self-monitoring. He does not let his emotions shine through. He is not particularly verbose, actually, at all. He allows himself, I think, precisely, one joke or public comment when he's serving as head of the president of the Constitutional Convention. But he commands authority. He commands respect. He commands an army. And so he has that natural moral authority. Lincoln, beats Washington by height, but he is not the most self-monitoring of men. He's not a general. He's not an executive. It's important to really reflect on what an unlikely president he was for a nation on the verge of civil war. He'd never held any executive position. Hadn't been a governor, mayor, run a business, even been a senator. He had one term in Congress. One term for a political party that didn't even exist anymore. Didn't have any military experience to speak of. He was an honorary colonel in the Black Hawk War. And he used to joke that, the bloodiest combat he saw was with mosquitoes. And he's representing this upstart political party. Now, Washington, of course, refused to join a political party as a matter of principle. I often like to joke that, the Constitution doesn't mention political parties, but it does mention journalism. But Washington, was an independent president as a matter of principle. And Washington's independence helped give him his moral authority. But here's Lincoln leading an upstart political party that some folks said if that was elected, that would lead to this, secession. It would spur the breakup of the Union. And Washington is very much a figure of debate at the time. Everyone's always trying to claim the mantle of Washington, including people who are trying to divide the nation. That's what Washington would call the impostures of pretend patriotism. People who are trying to divide the country, pretending that they're the purer patriots than anybody else. So they're very different men. I mean, Lincoln is a prairie lawyer. He tells jokes all the time, much to, I think, the distraction and annoyance of many of his contemporaries. You hear it all the time. We underestimate Lincoln's sense of humor. You go from Washington to be enormously self-monitoring, and Lincoln can't stop telling jokes and telling stories. And it's a conscious tool of communication on his part. But a lot of people are saying, well, this doesn't fit the model of president in this serious time. How dare you tell jokes all the time? But for Lincoln, it was a way of communicating with common people, and also it was a form of self-medication. Lincoln is much more sunshine and shadow. He is not trying to hide his emotions behind the mask of command in the same way that George Washington does. But for all their differences, superficially, they both are very much committed to a couple of fundamental ideas: moderation, moral courage, virtue. One of the quotes I love about Washington is from Thomas Jefferson, who, is a dodgy character in his rise up the greasy pole of politics before he becomes president. But he got this right about Washington, I think. He said, the moderation and virtue of a single character probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of the liberty it was intended to establish. Moderation and virtue. Moderation and virtue are two of the words that sum up Abraham Lincoln's character. He combines moderation with moral courage, two things that don't often go together. He's willing to call out the core contradictions to the American ideal. But he's able to do it in a way that brings people together. He's got a reputation for honesty and empathy and humor and humility. He is flexible, not fanatical. He has his eye on great goals, but is very flexible in terms of how those goals are achieved. And both men are deeply committed to, I think, the politics of the golden rule, something so basic that we forget it. This basic civic contract of treating other people as you'd like to be treated, that's how democracy actually works. That's the unspoken thing. It's that you treat other people like you'd like to be treated. You're going to have all sorts of principled disagreements, and sometimes they're going to get heated. Ideally, you fall back on reason, and both men tried to do that. Sometimes your emotions may get the better of you, but you try to temper that with reason and decency. And I think both men did. And they also, in divided times, fundamentally believed that there was more than united us than divided us as Americans. They didn't try to divide in order to conquer, which is the easiest way to achieve political power. And, when Lincoln finally ascends to the presidency, after he's led the nation through this harrowing experience, and the nation is still not on the other side, but when he gives that second inaugural address, one of the things that really struck me is that as he gives the speech, he is looking out over not only the first integrated inaugural audience in our history, but looking out directly square opposite him of a statue of Washington. It's a statue that now is in the Smithsonian. It's sort of the odd one where he's dressed in a Roman toga. But the reason he's depicted that way is to draw that direct connection between the ancient republics in Greece and Rome. This is the trust that's being carried forward between them. And Washington is so present in the national debates. Lincoln orders the farewell address to be read aloud in cities and to armies, and they gathered together on Washington's birthday to remind people of what we're fighting for, and also to be mindful of the dangers of forgetting Washington's fundamental lessons about focusing on national unity and political moderation, warning about the dangers of excessive debt, the importance of morality to our politics. So Washington is such a constant figure. Even as people try to claim Washington's mantle for his own, as the Confederacy did, Lincoln was not distracted by that. And he does form a direct connection, I think in some ways fusing the wisdom of Washington and Hamilton and carrying it forward to this new vision, a national vision. Lincoln admired Washington, I think, above all men. And now they're honored together. And I do think it's because of their virtues. It's because of the continuity in the story. And when we look back on the struggles that Lincoln and Washington faced, they make ours today look comparatively small. Now, I don't want to diminish them because they're serious, right? It's driving into the dangers of tribal politics, to the things that they warned against. But we have been through much worse before. And the moderation and virtue and courage of Washington and Lincoln carried us forward. And those were uncommon characteristics in their own time. But the fidelity that Lincoln felt to Washington's example, not to try to mimic it, but to make it his own, that's what gave it power. That's what gave it resonance. That's what kept the fire of liberty alive. And the word liberty is advised. The founders knew this, and I think Lincoln did as well, is that there's a fundamental difference between the words independence and freedom and liberty, although we use them interchangeably. Freedom can be a state of nature, but liberty implies responsibility, that civic responsibility. And it's not for nothing that the two words that Washington uses most in the farewell address are citizen and union. That emphasis of what unites us and the responsibilities we all have, the obligation to the opportunities of living in this nation. And that's what Lincoln carries forward as well. He really revives that civic spirit. And that's why I think we look to them in our most difficult days, just as Lincoln looked back at Washington. But I do believe their lessons are more urgent than ever before. It's not that we're going to find another Washington or another Lincoln. Don't go looking in that direction. Look for people who carry forward a similar spirit. Similar spirits of a commitment of moderation and virtue and moral courage. That defiant belief that there's more that unites us than divides us. That deep commitment to the politics of the golden rule, even when everyone else is playing a different game. Because by steering towards that horizon, carrying forward that journey, that's how you are able to be a uniter in divided times. And you do that by building on the firmest foundation there is, the legacy of Washington and Lincoln. Anyway, thank you very much. I'd love to take some questions from you all.
Like John said, we are going to have the opportunity for questions. I'm going to kick things off, though, since I was the host, and so I get to. Both men are their presidencies are famed for their cabinets, especially for the sort of diversity of opinion within their cabinets. I would argue Lincoln's a little more purposefully diverse than Washington's. I don't think Washington quite knew what he was getting into, but I'm happy to have your opinion on that. But I was wondering what was the role of diverse opinion and the cabinet and advising within both men's presidencies?
Absolutely great question. And as I said, this is the first time I've given that speech, and now I'm going to include that question in it, or the point, because it is a point of parallelism. We are used to a a lot of presidents putting together cabinets full of yes men, people who are sure to not outshine them. That's not the way Washington and Lincoln approached a cabinet. Right. I mean, Doris Kearns Goodwin famously says, a team of rivals. But, I think Washington had a degree of intentionality around that. You hear Adams talk about Washington's cabinet and how cabinet meetings are run. And he wanted to hear all sides. He wanted to have a vigorous debate, and then he would take it all in and make a decision. And indeed, that's what Lincoln did as well. Again, Washington's got a background as a general. Politics are comparatively chaotic. Lincoln's background is as a lawyer. So he's looking for the deeper constitutional principle, the logical through line, and some idea of implementation. And in particular, I mean, they're both dealing with deep divisions and dissensions. I mean, the fights between Hamilton and Jefferson are famous and provide the basis for our two-party system. But in Lincoln's time, I mean, the division between the radical Republicans, who John Hay, his secretary, called Jacobins, people, who wanted to make the perfect the enemy of the good, he felt, when it came to Reconstruction and focusing on punishing the South, revenge, retribution, rather than reconciliation, which was Lincoln's main goal, but not at the expense of emancipation. I think both men showed a great deep confidence of character in that they could be surrounded by, and they wanted to be surrounded by, dissenting opinions. I think the real weakness is from leaders who need to be surrounded by yes men. It's a lesson we keep learning, maybe a bit belatedly, but that strong men, the so-called strong man, is really weak. They're so weak they can't handle dissent. They can't handle a difference of opinion when, by all accounts, that would make them better. That would make their policies better, would make them more seaworthy, if you will. So I think it's a great question. I think there is a parallelism between that regard. What else? Yes, sir. Wait, hold on. Wow, you got a loud voice, but for folks at home, we're gonna.
Oh, thank you.
But which is awesome.
Yes, sir. Test 1, 2.
You got it.
All right.
You're good.
I'll use my teacher voice.
All right.
In your book, I haven't had the privilege of reading it yet. Could you give us a spoiler alert? If Lincoln is the good guy trying to look forward to peace from those statements, that marvelous meeting with the generals on the steamboat and all that, who's the heavy? Who are the bad guys? I'm tempted to think it's probably going to be Edward Stanton, but who's the heavy in your book?
No, not Stanton per se. I mean, first of all, the Confederates. I mean, but Lincoln made a great distinction between the leadership class of Confederates who ought to have known better, right? Members of Congress, military, the courts, who defected to the South, and then the rank and file who he feels are misled. He actually wants to show a great deal of mercy and reckon, and give amnesty to those folks, the rank and file. And he wants to use that as a counterweight to start moving towards voting rights and full rights for African Americans, and beginning with Black Union soldiers, Black Union veterans, of whom there were 180,000, 25 of whom won the Medal of Honor. And those are folks we should be building statues to, it seems to me. I think in the book, because this book, and I did not frame this talk as a classic book talk. My book is Lincoln and the Fight for Peace is about Lincoln's plan to win the peace after winning the war. It's about his vision of national reconciliation and reunification. And in that, the unwitting villain ultimately is Andrew Johnson, is his vice president. It's politically inspired on some level. Lincoln's running for election as a member of the National Unity ticket, and he's going to balance it with a so-called war Democrat. But study the American presidency, I think all history ultimately comes down to character. That's a point that David McCullough made over and over again. Character is the indispensable quality, and that's what both Lincoln and Washington had in spades. And Andrew Johnson is the anti-Lincoln in many respects. I mean, he's not a reconciler. He's alternately radical and reactionary. And the secret to Lincoln's leadership in many respects is that he's a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries. It's a different kind of challenge than the one Washington faced, although it's one that Washington warned against. I found this quote from the Atlantic Monthly, a contemporary profile of Andrew Johnson, in which they describe him as being vain and egotistic to the point of mental disease. But it's not just that. It's that he acquiesces at a critical moment and gives amnesty to powerful former Confederates. I mean, he vetoes an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is getting a little bit specific, but a really innovative public-private organization that Lincoln signed into law that was designed to sort of move former slaves to self-sufficiency and help poor white refugees in the South as well. He vetoes the Civil Rights Act, says it would confer special rights, that language that we hear every so often. And he acquiesces also to Confederates and state legislatures who were putting forward the black codes, that's what they were called, these laws, as early as late summer, early fall, 1865. There's one extraordinary moment where a former Confederate brigadier general is speaking to the Mississippi state legislature, and he says, look, we have to accept that slavery is over, but that doesn't mean we need to accept equality. And they begin imposing, the laws that would underpin segregation then. And I think that Lincoln would have resisted that. So I think it comes down to a question of character. Lincoln had it. Andrew Johnson, he was trying the best he could, but he was driven by his demons. His weaknesses defined him. His thin skin, his vanity, his lurching from radical to reactionary, his deep racism, which is not uncommon at the time, but was particularly pronounced in several outbursts. That set us off on a tragic path that shows us the cost of not fully winning the peace.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Really great talk. I was here for your farewell address. Talk about 5 years ago. Also awesome. A little bit of a psychological question, I guess, in trying to understand, like from a Southerner's perspective, Lincoln is probably the most divisive president we could have. The thought of,
interesting,
how are you a uniter if it's rumored that if you take office, the country will split? And so how do you kind of remedy those two ideas?
It's great. First, it's a wonderful question, an important question. First of all, it's a reminder that just like with Washington and Lincoln, they seem hugely unifying, but it's a good reminder that they were widely hated in their time, and that those hates were not necessarily based on rational emotions. I mean, if you go back and look at Lincoln's first inaugural address, he's saying over and over again what he said during the campaign and before then. I mean, he's saying, look, I do not think as president I have the power to end slavery. I merely oppose its extension. He says it many times early on. He says, I'm not anti-South. I'm not anti-Southerner. I'm anti-slavery. But crucially, he says, they are just what we would be if we were in their position. I mean, over and over again. I mean, Lincoln is born in the South. He's born in Kentucky. He married a Southerner. Mary's family are on the side of the Confederacy. In one really extraordinary example of empathy that was not particularly popular, when Mary's brother dies, they have the sister-in-law come visit to the White House. There are whispers that and she refused to sign loyalty papers to cross the Mason-Dixon line. And that itself was a statement about putting family, that this is a family fight and family needs to, come first. And we need to keep our politics, even when they spill over into this degree of difference, in perspective. So Lincoln sends signals over and over again about his desire for magnanimity, that he doesn't want to, sort of rip the South up from the roots, although he insists on ending slavery for all time. He says, no man wants peace more than I, but I'm unwilling to accept peace on a condition of which would guarantee more war. So I think if you look at what Lincoln's doing consistently, he really is reaching out, and the extent to which he is demonized out of the gate by Southerners, that speaks to the larger political dangers of I think tribal politics. I mean, they're saying, if you elect Abraham Lincoln, we will secede. And Lincoln gently mocks that and says, that's like a robber coming up to me and pointing a gun at my head and saying, if you don't give me your money, I will shoot you and you will be a murderer. But the danger really is, it's about the psychological preconditions for war, civil war in particular, is that if people are convinced that losing an election is tantamount to losing their way of life, that's the psychological precondition for civil war. And I think the other great danger that history is very clear on that we need to be wide-eyed about is the danger of lost cause mythology. That's the foundation of which segregation is built. This idea that the South didn't really lose the war. If they did, they fought for a noble cause. They weren't fighting for slavery. They were fighting for, states' rights or constitutional liberty. It's a very common refrain. And indeed, that was one of the things we saw in the wake of the failures of the Treaty of Versailles. Germans did not accept defeat. And I think if you look at Lincoln's plan to win the peace, which is primarily what my book is about, it's not just unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. It's that there's going to be followed by political reform and economic expansion westward. He's passed laws that are designed to reunite the nation, and by moving the nation's attention westward through the Transcontinental Railroad, Homestead Act, land grant colleges. But he also wants to invest in the South and have the South buy into Reconstruction. That's one of the reasons he wants a different model for every state to see what works, as long as some basic conditions are met, like renouncing slavery and ratifying the 13th Amendment. So I think to a large extent, the demonization of Abraham Lincoln that occurs within contemporary politics in 1860 does not match what he's constantly saying. But I do think the power of his example is what made a difference and ultimately could have made the greatest difference. One of the stories I tell in the book is towards the end of the war, he's visiting City Point, and he visits the Depot Field Hospital. It's a huge hospital full of wounded Union soldiers and officers. And he does what presidents do. To this day, Walter Reed, he goes by and he interviews, talks to every soldier. Tell me your name. Tell me your story. And Lincoln's a very emotional guy. And he's getting all worked up. And finally he's done after hours and hours. And he sees another smaller tent out back. And he says, "What's that?" to the physician who's kind of touring him around. And he says, "Oh, you don't need to go there. Those are just wounded rebel soldiers." And Lincoln says, "That's exactly where I do need to go." And he goes and he does the same thing to each of them. He introduces himself. He says, "I hope you will not refuse me my hand." And decades later, you hear these stories, the soldiers tell the story of when they met Abraham Lincoln. They said, "The moment he opened his mouth, I knew I was licked." Because they'd been told he was a tyrant and a butcher, and they realized that he was a kind and a good man. And you see that story over and over again. And if he'd had more time to set that example, I think it could have changed hearts and minds. Not entirely, but gone a long way further in that direction. What else? Oh, don't be shy. All right, we got two more. There you go.
Admittedly, I'm going to sound okay. Sorry. My ears are not good anymore. Admittedly, I'm going to move us slightly away from a historical question, but
okay,
more about kind of the writing of the book itself. So
Great.
you wrote a book before about Washington's farewell address, and now you've written a book about Abraham Lincoln. Did the parallels between the two and the differences, was that suggested through the writing of the book, or was that you went in with the expectation of kind of these parallels, and that's what you kind of was so
great question.
Inspired that?
Great question. I think I approached Washington's farewell as, a deep dive into what had been the nation's most famous speech that contained sort of the sum total of Washington's wisdom and its warnings for future generations about the forces that could destroy a democratic republic, chief of which are hyperpartisanship, excessive debt, foreign wars, and foreign interference in our elections. So, when it was published, I had no idea we were going to be in that particular circumstance, but, Washington could see further than most. Lincoln, as I tried to indicate, picks up the story at a point of maximum peril, where many of those worst case scenarios were occurring. I mean, we forget to some extent the way in which the groundwork for secession had been laid for decades on the basis of tribal politics. It's not just, Charles Sumner getting caned on the floor of Congress. The author and Professor Joanne Freeman shows in her book, Field of Blood, there are more than 70 incidents of violence on the floor of Congress in the years running up to the Civil War. That the political parties, such as they were, had become, divided by geography and ideology along a really fundamental disagreement about something basic like slavery and its expansion. Um, and so Lincoln was inheriting a country where Washington's worst fears were coming true. And so it's a way of carrying forward that story. But Lincoln doesn't have the benefit what Washington did of being able to draw on precedent, no matter how distant it might be. There'd never been a civil war on this scale before. Lincoln could gain courage from the struggles and the sacrifices of the revolutionary generation, but the challenges were fundamentally different. He's trying to defend a democratic republic from destroying itself. And that's his key insight, is that, in a civil war, you can't simply pound your opponents into submission and salt the fields. You need to find a way to live together again. And that requires a kind of leadership that's able to look beyond the pain of the moment, to imagine a future that's not predetermined by the pain of the past, and to really put processes in place that can reunite a nation after the war is won on the battlefield. And so it's a continuation of the same story. It's a jump cut, if you will, to Washington's nightmare. And what a leader of a similar spirit, I describe Lincoln as a soulful centrist. But, he's a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries, but how he is able to step in and really heal the nation, although he does not get to live to see his vision vindicated. So it's a continuation of the same themes. I think, I'm to some extent, I'm guilty as a journalist and an author that on some level, all my books and many of my columns are about how we overcome hyperpartisanship and polarization. Because I have been concerned from very early on that those are the forces that do destroy democratic republics. And Washington warned about it. And there is something, I think, wise and strong fundamentally about marrying moderation with moral courage. So it's a continuity. There's a deep continuity between the two stories. I think they function together. And the notes that play between each other, Lincoln appears in Washington's farewell and the afterlife of the idea, because Lincoln would quote the farewell address and ordered it to be read in front of troops. And certainly there's a lot of Washington in Lincoln in the Fight for Peace, because he's drawing on that inspiration so often. Sure. What else? Lady in yellow. Yes.
Can you think of somebody in more recent history, the past 40 or 50 years, who maybe exemplified some of their moral courage and so on?
It's a good question. I usually get even the more difficult version of that, which is, who today? 50 years is an interesting window. I mean, I do think, my book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, ends somewhat unexpectedly with the Marshall Plan, because it's an example of winning the peace by applying Lincoln's principles quite consciously in this case. Unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. I found a quote from General Lucius Clay, who was the general who oversaw the occupation of Germany, who himself was from the South. And he was asked, what guided your decisions? And he said, I tried to think what Lincoln would have done for the South if he had lived. So there was this conscious focus on how you win a peace, what we had failed to do after the First World War through that generation. I think Harry Truman exemplified many of those virtues, but that's outside your 50-year limit. 6 years, yeah, a little bit more than that, unfortunately, 75. I think Reagan is a far more ideological figure than either of them, but I do think that he was able to steer towards the horizon and retain a deep faith in this idea that there's more than unites us than divides us as Americans. And he's been on my mind a lot lately, because in his inaugural in 1981, he makes the point that we take the peaceful transfer of power for granted in this country. I do think a lot of the themes Lincoln talks about, I think President Obama rhetorically touches on, and in some ways exemplifies, as somebody who announced his campaign for the presidency as a senator for Illinois in front of the old Illinois State House. And as David Blight says, a professor, as long as we have a politics of race in this country, we have a politics of the Civil War. These things carry forward. And that's why it's important to understand our history, right? we want to make the old stories new again, and because it does create a sense of context and perspective. And when we take some of these figures off the pedestal, it makes their wisdom a little more accessible. They're more interesting when they're flawed, including Washington. Who else? Yes, sir.
Dr. Carolyn Janey of the University of Virginia wrote a terrific book recently called Ends of War. And it covers the period of the fall of Petersburg to a year and a half after that surrender at Appomattox. I'm wondering if you might comment, because Grant shared a lot of the voiced a lot of the things that President Lincoln wanted to do, but he eventually became president as well. Have you come across anything of how Washington influenced President Grant?
It's a great question. I've never gotten that before. I mean, there's a book called Let There Be Peace, which talks about Grant's sort of political and military philosophy. And certainly he does harken back a lot to Washington, which is not a surprise. And obviously there's the parallelism of being, holding, he's the first commander of the, Union Army, the American Army, that has the same stature of, as Washington. But, it's worth talking about Grant a little bit further. I think you said it right. If you look at the terms of surrender that Grant writes at Appomattox, famously generous terms of surrender, they go a long way towards healing some of the divisions. And you pay attention to the conversations that Grant has been having with Lincoln in Petersburg just a few days before for an hour and a half on a porch. A few days before that on the River Queen in that famous painting, The Peacemakers, where Lincoln is listening intently to Sherman, make a story, snap his fingers, predicting the imminent end of the war. Grant's on the couch, Admiral Porter's next to them. The speech, which was purchased by Harry Truman in 1947, hangs in the White House. It's very clear that Grant was effectively taking dictation from Lincoln in his mind. Some of the lines that Lincoln would be repeating at that point of his life, he'd say, give them, let them have their horses to go home and plow fields with, let them have their guns, sidearms to go home and shoot crows with. We want them to return to home and live under the laws, give them the most liberal and honorable terms. That's Lincoln's words. And so in a matter of speaking, but with some of those specific provisions, those are things that show up in the surrender, terms of surrender that Grant lists for Lee at Appomattox. And then as president, I do think that Lincoln's influence continues to shine on. I think in particular in Grant's heroic actions in containing the first incarnation of the KKK, where Grant intervenes. He goes to Congress directly to lobby for the passment of the Enforcement Act, and he has it implemented by a Southern Attorney General, Amos T. Ackerman, which I think is a very Lincolnian note, but also one that Washington would recognize. By having a Southern Attorney General who'd actually served in the Confederate Army briefly, somewhat reluctantly, serve as your Attorney General, and I can remember another Southerner serving as Solicitor General, prosecute the leaders of the KKK, and give the rank and file amnesty, but take the leadership and send them over to Albany, for long prison terms up in Albany. It really did decapitate that first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. And I think it was aided by the fact that, it was done by a Southern Attorney General. That's a very Washington and Lincoln thing to do. And I think that chapter in particular of Grant's presidency is enormously honorable and effective, and there are lessons that we can learn from it to this day. Yes, sir.
A question to your direct wheelhouse. How would you rate Washington and Lincoln's handling or dealing with the press during their presidency?
I thought you were going to ask me to rank them, and I was going to say, oh man, not going to do that. Look, I think that Washington was stung by the coverage in the press because, I mean, he was a general used to a high degree of deference, and here he's being attacked in the press all the time. People, editors who are kind of poking him and prodding him, looking for his attention, and he really, I mean, he became very thin-skinned towards the end of his second term about the criticisms he was receiving in the press. He called them, I believe, infamous scribblers. But he and look, with very good reason. I mean, let's not forget that one of the things Jefferson does at sort of the birth of the two-party system is that he puts Phil Freneau, an editor who'd gone to school with James Madison, on the payroll in the State Department while editing, I think it's the National Gazette, to criticize the Washington administration, in particular its foreign policy. I mean, it's totally duplicitous. That the Secretary of State is basically, incubating a newspaper that's hostile not only to the administration in which he serves, but to its foreign policy with regard to France. So he's got reason to be irritable, but all the founding fathers would fight through the papers. It's a reminder that partisan media isn't anything new, although its scope and reach is a little bit different right now. I think Washington, at the end of the day, you read his comments about the dangers of giving up freedom of speech. Deaf and dumb will be led to like lambs to the slaughter. I think he intellectually understood the primacy of free speech and a free press. I think Lincoln was a much more vociferous consumer of news. I mean, he got newspapers delivered to him from across the country. They were political dispatches, and he took great delight. In fact, was a silent owner in a German language newspaper in Illinois. Incidentally, both men were very pro-immigration, for what it's worth. In different times and contexts, but I think that Lincoln would occasionally certainly lose his cool, and some of the great journalists of his time. I mean, I quote some beautiful writers: Thomas Morris Chester, Black War correspondent for the Philadelphia Press, is an extraordinary writer. And other ones who are legendary figures, are really pretty opportunistic and kind of. They'll be with them one day and with another. The other thing really strikes me is that, I mean, the publisher of the New York Times was the chairman of the Republican Party. I mean, seriously. So those relations were much closer. I'd say on balance, Lincoln had a better feel for the press than Lincoln did. He understood, rather than Washington did. I think he understood the thrust and parry of it all, and could see it with a sense of perspective and sometimes a sense of humor.
All right, and John will be available after this while he's signing books to answer any more questions.
Can I close with one thing,
Yeah.
unless you have a final question? Because there's one quote that I begin the Lincoln book with that I love, and it's a quote that is not well known in the Lincoln canon, but I think it goes directly to the power of applied history, and the reasons we ought to study history and how we ought to study history. And he gives it. This is the night after he wins re-election, 1864, the highest stakes election you can possibly imagine, right? He has won a resounding victory, aided by Sherman toppling Atlanta, and he says this: human nature will not change. In any future great national trial, compared with the men of this, we shall have as weak and as strong, as silly and as wise, as bad and as good. Let us therefore study the incidents of this as philosophy to learn wisdom from, and none of them as wrongs to be revenged. What I love about that, even when we study the founding era or we study the Civil War, we need to keep the flawed humanity of the principles and everybody intact. It does make them more interesting. And when we do that, we can aspire just a little bit closer to reaching their level. They weren't perfect, neither are we. They're on a very elevated plane. They proved their success at a critical time and chapter in our nation's history. But they were flawed. They were silly and wise, good and bad. And the fact that Lincoln at that moment in history is also reflecting the moment through the glass to see himself through the eyes of future historians is an extraordinary trick. That's one of the things that Lincoln consciously does. In his best speeches, he connects the past with the present and the future. But he never does it, I think, as concisely and explicitly as that. Let us study the incidents of this as philosophy to learn wisdom from, to look for useful lessons which we can apply in the future to keep our democratic republic on track, and not to ruminate them in a spirit of resentment as wrongs to be revenged. That resentment, that revenge is the opposite of reconciliation. And that's what Lincoln was all about, trying to perpetuate that national bond that Washington helped forge. And so when we look at our history with a forgiving eye, when we look at it with a sense of communion between the past and the present, something we carry forward into the future, that's where the magic happens. That's where the real responsibility is. That's where the opportunity is. Anyway, thank you very much.